Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So it's a really significant day for me. I have to say I am now at my 1000th interview on YouTube of this radio show. It's not actually my 100th show yet because I've had on some shows more than one guest, but it's 1,000 guests. And my 1000th guest to date is Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Aled before. He is an expert on housing and finance and lots of other things that are going on in the Canadian economy. He's got really quite an illustrious background, which I'll review later on. But tonight we're going to be talking about the real estate market in Canada and primarily, frankly, Greater Toronto area, because Aled Iorwerth and the CMHC about a month and a half ago came out with a major report that said that to have any level of reasonable affordability in housing in the Greater Toronto area in Southern Ontario, we needed 1.8 million additional homes in the next 8 years. 1.8 million more homes than would otherwise be built in the next 8 years. And yet at the same time, sir, we've got housing pricing that seems like it is going down, and some people think potentially set for a crash. We've got the City of Toronto and other cities that are jacking up development fees. We've got the City of Toronto that is putting in inclusionary zoning. So it looks, and we've got developers that, given the slowdown in housing prices, are putting some developments on hold. So it looks like you're saying that we need a lot more housing, but it's like a lot of other things in the economy are going the opposite direction that are going to give us less housing. Mm-hmm. The obvious question is, sir, what's going to happen? Is this only going to get worse, or you see a way through this issue?
It's a tough challenge at the moment. We need a lot more housing. We need a lot of change. We need a lot of innovation to get that. Not seeing that much of that at the moment. And as you say, the omens for short-term increases in housing supply are quite difficult. Probably developers are in a wait-and-see attitude with interest rates. They're having a hard time getting workers. Construction costs are going up. So all of this is making the supply situation quite challenging, but we desperately need all of this housing supply because we need affordability.
Why do we need affordability? Why is affordability important?
I think there are multiple reasons. The straightforward one is just how much money Canadians are spending on housing. If they're spending a lot of money on housing is more or less a necessity. They have to spend that money, but then that means that they're spending less money on other things that they would like. They may save less for retirement. So that's the direct impact of a loss of affordability. But there's also a wider impact in terms of a lot of the economy being devoted to housing, rather than more productive activities. So it's also curtailing labor mobility, and probably over the long term, well, probably even already, it's curtailing the growth of cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Canadians, immigrants are probably a little bit more reluctant to move to Toronto and Vancouver because of the high house prices, and that's a long-term drag on these cities' growth.
Let's see if you can possibly put it in perspective. I've heard statistics, and it'd be great if you actually knew the actual numbers or you had some sense of it, that Toronto, Mississauga, et cetera, are some of the most expensive or least affordable municipalities, not in just Canada, but in all of North America. And I think I saw a report that listed them as the 4th and 5th most expensive or least affordable homes relative to income in all of North America. And then, we've talked previously that housing relative to disposable income is twice as expensive in Canada as it is in the United States. In other words, it takes twice as much disposable income to buy the same house as it would in the United States. That's a astronomical difference. And people have, shown, houses in suburban metropolitan New York versus Toronto, Mississauga. So not maybe Manhattan, but sort of suburbia that are substantially more expensive. I was in Dallas, Texas recently, where I saw comparable homes for what would go for a couple $1 million in Toronto selling for $1 million, if not frankly under $1 million. Same thing in Kansas. So there's a lot of places in the United States where your money goes a lot farther, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. You were mentioning those places in sort of more Midwestern in the plains, but some of the major cities in the U.S., Atlanta, Phoenix, Houston, these cities have managed to get a lot of affordability. They have a dramatic increase in housing supply. They've had a lot of economic growth. They've had a lot of employment growth, and one of the reasons for a lot of that employment growth is that they've been able to keep housing costs reasonable, so that people are not inhibited from moving to these cities because of high housing costs, and this is quite common in a large swathes of the southern U.S.
So the big question is, what's caused it? Is it because the Bank of Canada has kept interest rates so low, so just a whole bunch of us have been crazy and have bid up the prices to astronomical levels? Or are we just producing a lot less homes than we otherwise should be?
Well, we've dug in a little bit into these numbers. We haven't published the results yet, but interest rates we think had played a part of it, but not a preponderance. So over the years, we have some rough estimates just off the top of my head that there were maybe around 10-20% of the price increase was caused by interest rates. The vast preponderance of it has basically been driven by a lack of housing supply. So you've had this inexorable increase in housing demand driven by population growth, immigration growth, higher incomes, all of these driving demand up, and the supply has not responded. So interest rates played a part. Don't want to diminish that, but the solution is more housing supply.
The solution is more housing supply. We're having a conversation tonight, my 1000th interview with a different guest, kind of a fun milestone to mark, with Dr. Alid Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of the CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with our economist guest. I'm going to ask him first about what's going to happen with increased interest rates and what he thinks is going to happen with that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a major task force that the Ontario government had that was trying to solve some of the problems that he has identified. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. This is my 1000th interview on this Saga 960 show. It's really quite kind of an interesting milestone. And I think it's completely appropriate that we're talking about, I think, one of the biggest issues for this 1000th show that we've got in Canada today. And it was a big issue in the last federal election, in the last provincial election. And I think it's going to be the issue in the upcoming municipal elections across Ontario. And that is housing affordability. Can we actually afford to live in the cities and the towns that we're living in? And I think, frankly, even worse, can our kids afford to live in the houses? Because some of us are lucky that we've actually, bought our house 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we've been able to create some net worth. And we're, talking about a lot of baby boomers that are going to be having a huge net worth in their homes that they may be able to transfer to their children if they so desire, if they got good kids. But what about those kids? Are they going to be actually able to buy anywhere close? Our guest is Dr. Alid Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. This man has got, one of those unbelievable resumes. He has, for the last 6 years and 6 months, been the Deputy Chief Economist at the CMHC. Before that, he worked in Finance Canada as a special advisor. It would appear for more than 15 years in different roles as senior economist, coordinator, director, special advisor, etc. You're also director at Environment Canada. So it'd be interesting to to hear some comments, sir, about this whole issue about can the economy grow and you solve the environmental issues we have at the same time. But maybe that's probably another conversation. He has a PhD from Western in economics, a master's degree in European and international relations from the University of Amsterdam, and a executive leadership diploma from the Sade Business School in the University of Oxford. So this man knows what he's talking about. Sir, we were just talking about interest rates and the impact of interest rates, and you were saying only about 15% of the increase in housing prices was caused by interest rates or low interest rates, which surprises me because a lot of people think that low interest rates created a bubble in a lot of asset sectors, stock market, a lot of interest in a lot of other areas, and as interest rates are now going up, people are suggesting it's going to be some softness in real estate prices. My understanding is that real estate prices are somewhere down by like 6% in the Toronto area, but volume is down like 47%. And I would think that volume's got to come down first before prices come down, because what ends up happening is, the sellers want to get their old prices, but if they have to wait, 90, 120 days, a lot longer than they did before, ultimately they'll end up reducing their prices. So probably we haven't actually seen the price impact that the lower volume, the dramatically lower volume, suggests that is going to actually have. It's a lagging economic statistic, would be my guess. And just anecdotally, I get an email once every couple of hours, like seriously, once every couple of hours, new price, better price. Like it's just unbelievable how many emails I'm getting from so many real estate agents talking about price reductions. So as the Bank of Canada has increased interest rates, some of the largest increase is interest rates in Canadian history. What do you think is going to happen to real estate prices?
Well, first of all, I should probably clarify a bit more that when that 10-15% was over a very long period. So what we're now facing with interest rates is a fairly rapid increase in interest rates in a fairly short amount of time. There are multiple things going on. Obviously, higher mortgage rates are going to cool the housing market. As you said, house prices have come down quite a bit. They were very frothy in the post-COVID period. So a lot of that froth has come out of the market. So we expect a lot this decline to continue in the short term, but what we're concerned about is more in the medium and the longer term, when hopefully the economy is stabilized again. As we discussed previously, we would not have had that increase in housing supply in the meantime. As the economy recovers, you get demand coming back, and this whole cycle of price increases starting again. So that's why we need to keep the emphasis on getting more housing supply, irrespective of what is happening in the macro economy. So yes, in the short term, price weakness, but this lack of housing supply, we expect will mean that prices can't come down for a long period.
So RBC came out with a major report just a couple of days ago, where they said that the pandemic era housing market boom is over, and that resales have fallen 31%. Resale volumes have fallen 30%. Prices are down 6% nationwide. Monthly declines of 5.3%. Ontario and British Columbia were the biggest drops, and that they expect a 100 basis point increase by the fall to 3.5% in the interest rates. And they're talking about Cambridge down 17%, Kitchener-Waterloo down 16%, Brantford down 14%, London down 14%, Guelph down 10%. This is significant, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's really an unwinding of this COVID the dash for the suburbs, the work from home technology, helping people work further from the city centers, people seeking more living spaces, moving out to the suburbs. So and that may persist, but that sort of initial boom from that, it seems to have dissipated. And so what we're generally seeing is that more expensive properties further from the city centers are coming down in price. Condominiums, it seems, are sort of in the city center of Toronto, are keeping relatively stable. I mean, they've come down a little bit perhaps, but the it's those really high price single detached homes further out that have come down, and those are the ones that have gone up the most as well. So and yeah.
So do you think this is a bust or just a softening?
I think it's a softening. It's there are risks on the downside, however. It is easier to make a case that there are downside risks at this moment. At the moment, we think it's pause maybe too diplomatic. There will be a decline. But as I said, eventually you would expect market fundamentals driven by strong demand to reemerge, and house prices to continue going up because of the lack of housing supply. Now, before that happens, there are a lot of risks at the moment. There's high debt levels, and we're in uncertain territory with house prices because of these high debt levels. So there are significant risks in the downside. To the downside, we don't see them materializing right now, but those risks are there.
Can you give me any sense of how high the debt level is, either relative to the past or to the United States, or any other metric to give a sense? Because my sense that I get from what I read is that the debt levels are like twice what it would be for a comparable person in the United States, and significantly higher for an individual in Canada than it's ever been before.
Well, the often quoted metric, and I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but is the ratio of debt to disposable income, and that's in the area of 170%, which is really astronomical. The only other country that comes close is Australia, which is they've had a housing boom as well. So these are astronomical numbers. They've been going up constantly over the last decade, and they're significantly higher than in the US. So there are other metrics, debt to GDP, which is less commonly used. That's of the order of 100%, I think, which is again a little bit in the danger zone. So it's these debt numbers that give us pause. And
so if debt to disposable income is 170% today, any idea what it would have been, a generation ago, or what it is in the United States?
Well, a generation ago, it would have been less than 100%, from my memory. Yeah. Certainly in the US, it reached high levels in 2008, but I think it's broadly flatlined over the last decade.
And at the same time, we've got these high debt loads. My sense is that a lot of people are in variable interest rates, more people in variable interest rate mortgages, or equity lines of credit or things like that than ever before. Is that not also a risk?
Yes, we produced a report last June, our mortgage interest report, which showed that there'd been quite a spike in the proportion of people with variable loans. It was around half of mortgages now, or of mortgages now have variable rates. It was really spiking over the last year or two.
And, I don't know if this is true or not, but it seems to me like a generation ago, almost no one had variable rate. Everyone had a fixed rate mortgage.
Yeah, exactly. So the preference had been a decade or two ago to favor stability, that you have that conventional 5-year fixed rate, and you could sleep at night. Now it seems that people are stretching with these variable rates. They may have seen interest rates starting to go up and said, well, at least we can ensure that we're paying fairly low interest rates in the short term. I mean, the problem is we're not really seeing those interest rates up.
In the United States, you can deduct your mortgage interest against your income. They've got mortgage interest deductibility. In Canada, we don't. So you got to pay all of that mortgage interest out of, after-tax dollars. Given that, why would we have so much more home ownership, and so much higher house prices than the United States? But why is it?
I think the main reason is that some of our large cities have just not responded in terms of housing supply. So in the US, it's a little bit more even. You had cities like San Francisco, Boston, New York. They've had very strong growth, and they've had very high skyrocketing house prices. But they're probably, in terms of population, a relatively small part of the US. So on average, because you have places like Houston, Atlanta with affordability, on average, house prices are fairly reasonable in the US. In Canada, our large metro areas, Toronto, Vancouver, and increasingly Montreal are facing these affordability challenges, strong demand growth, no supply. So the places in Canada where supply has been responding have been more Calgary and Edmonton, which are so these places are relatively smaller part of the population. So when your largest cities don't have the housing supply, average house prices for the whole country go up.
So are developers and home builders in the United States just doing a far better job? And for some reason, those developers and home builders in Canada are like acting like an oligopoly and trying to jack prices up?
Well, usually these developers operate within some sort of policy framework. So my usual belief is that businesses will try and produce as much as they can to produce as much profit as they can. So given the freedom to do so, they'll go and forth and produce as much housing as they can. It's the supply framework, the policy governance issues that I think are holding them back.
So it's not the home builders that are the problem, and it's not the banks, because the banks are willing to lend a lot of money. If anything, you're worried they've lent too much money. So the problem is government. The government's not supplying it. Is that it?
Well, this is where it starts to get really complicated, and to narrow down exactly what the cause of the problem is. But there's so many candidates in there to try and understand what's going on. It gets a little bit difficult. So the one I'm really focused on is just the time it takes to go through the approval processes. I mean, we're hearing in Vancouver and Toronto, 5 years plus to go through approvals, whereas in places I talked about earlier with a lot of housing supply, like Edmonton, it's a question of a year or two. So it's these time to approvals that I think are really gumming up the system. There are other things as well, development fees, additional regulations, etc. But faced with this uncertainty of going through multiple years of approval, this must make life very difficult.
So why does it take so long? And is that length of time much longer than it would be in the United States, for an example?
Well, it depends on where in the U.S. So I think there's a common problem in San Francisco, New York, that it's difficult to build. There's a lot of NIMBYism, particularly in San Francisco. So these local sort of the local political economy influences the type of governance that is put in place. And so there's a combination then of municipal policies, politics that are restricting supply.
But, I keep hearing this thing about NIMBYs or NIMBYism, but there's always going to be people that say yes or no to different policies. Is really the issue NIMBYism, or is it politicians that don't have the backbone to make the right decision and stand up to NIMBYism?
Well, politicians need to get elected, so I think they need to reflect the wills of their local populace. So that's a bit of a chicken and egg question.
Okay, but if
No- no-
we
no-
all
no-
have to, if we all have to take vaccines, then politicians do what they need to do, and they go out and they get smart people to educate us and sell us and convince us that we have to get vaccines. And so it's not a case of you just got to say that the politicians get a free pass because they got people complaining. And you've been in those meetings that I'd probably be in. It's a very small but vocal minority that ends up objecting. It's the silent majority that's out there that people aren't listening to.
Yes, and that's where this whole issue of governance starts to play. Are there mechanisms to, shall we say, redistribute the decision power to reflect that silent majority, the families that are concerned about getting housing for their children, etc. The people from outside who want to move in to get a job but can't do so because there's no housing available. Are there governance mechanisms different from what we have today that can get to better decisions?
We're chatting tonight about housing, both is it too expensive? Is it affordable? And is there something that we should be changing in that regard? And what is going to happen with increased interest rates? And also we're talking about what government can do and should do with Dr. Alid Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at the CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask him about this new proposal that Premier Ford's come out with about super mayors. Sounds sort of like Superman. We're going to take a break and be right back with you. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Alid Iorwerth, Dr. Alid Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. He has got really quite an impressive career. And about a month and a half ago, he came out with a report that there's no quick fix to Canada's affordability problems. And he discussed in that report that we need in Southern Ontario 1.8 million additional homes in excess of what otherwise is going to be built anyway. So it's not 1.8 million more homes, but it's 1.8 million more homes than otherwise would normally be built if we're going to have a level of affordability in the Greater Toronto Area. And I think this is really an issue for all of us, because if we can't live here, if our kids can't live here, if the people that are going to be serving us at McDonald's or, being our employees at our companies and or opening up new companies can't afford to live here, what are we creating? And if the doctor is right that our level of affordability is like half of what it is in the United States, that we're paying twice as much of our disposable income for housing as people in the United States are, doesn't that suggest that we've really got it wrong somehow? Like we've really made a blank mistake. And sir, the provincial government has been thinking about doing some stuff. It hasn't actually done a lot, but it's been thinking about doing some stuff. Let me ask you about some of the stuff that they've done. So number one, Premier Ford has made a proposal to create super mayors in Toronto and Ottawa. And it's part and parcel of, they have these powers if they're going to work on increased housing. And they have the right to now put forward a budget rather than the budget having to come from the whole council, and then the council has to vote on it. They're able to appoint some department heads. They can overrule some things to effectively, it suggests, almost achieve provincial housing priorities. And the Globe and Mail actually today, you might have seen it, did a really interesting editorial suggesting that this almost made Premier Ford the super mayor of Ontario, because he was suggesting that he could use this as a way of getting the mayors of to first Ottawa and Toronto to do what he wants. And I understand he was at the AMO conference yesterday or today, suggesting he wants to roll this out to other cities, assuming it works. Is this a good strategy?
Well, I guess I'd be in favor of trying anything. I mean, we've dug ourselves into quite a hole, as you said. So I think it's time to experiment. It's time to innovate. And so This is just one tool, and hopefully there are a lot more tools that can be thrown at the issue. The hope must be that if the mayor is, say, and this is where you start to get into the details and all sorts of governance issues, but if the mayor is answerable to the whole city, then he can take the city's perspective in designing policy rather than more local considerations. And so you would hope that the mayor would then see that city growth, the growth of the population of the city, its sustainable growth is critical to his electoral hopes. And in that case, more housing supply would be forefront in his agenda.
You know, the implication of having to have a mayor that thinks about the whole city and can overrule council, doesn't it really suggest that local council members are making myopic decisions only for the benefit of getting elected by giving into NIMBYism rather than actually making the right decisions for the city of Toronto or Mississauga or the Greater Toronto Area?
But unfortunately, that's the way the system has been set up. So that's why I think we need to experiment with alternative governance mechanisms. Is there a way that people are more answerable for the economic growth of the whole city rather than their particular neighborhood?
This past spring, the Ontario government had a task force on housing affordability, and they came up with 55 different recommendations. And the task force, from what I understand, was populated by people from the industry, but also people from just the general population. And they actually had a couple of economists on the task force as well, if you can believe it. Of the 55, they only had something like 5 that they included in a bill that they put forward to the Ontario legislature. So they left out the vast majority, and they left out, from what I understand, some of the most ambitious programs. One of them was a proposal that would allow everyone that owns a single family home to have the right, without having to go through zoning, official plan, whatever, processes that you say take too long, to effectively split it into 4, that they could have a granny suite or a mother-in-law suite or a laneway house or a basement apartment, etc. Do you think that makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, we have to try everything. Now, we can't do this on its own. It has to be part of, as you said, 55 proposals. So let's experiment with all of them. As a standalone proposal, I mean, there are pros and cons to this. On the pros, I don't really understand why you would restrict what a household would want to do with their own house. On the downside, it may not be a sufficient scale. I mean, we need massive amounts of new housing, and redeveloping single detached 1 to 4. The scale may not be there. But like I said, this is part of a whole suite of things that need to be tried. We need to experiment with all sorts of things. Some of them will succeed, some of them will fail. And the more you try, the better chance you have of succeeding. So it's the sort of thing that we need.
My information is that something like 97% of all of the cases that go to the Ontario Land Tribunal are found in favor of developers. So it's like an astronomical positive percentage for developers. Yet the cities and other interveners continue to oppose. One of the other proposals that this task force had was making it more difficult for interveners to oppose, and actually charging them higher fees to oppose, and putting them at risk of having to pay legal costs. What do you think of those proposals?
Absolutely. I mean, if people are putting up these barriers, then they have to face the consequences and cost of doing so. And the cost of slowing down housing supply are absolutely enormous. So the costs of slowing housing supply may not be apparent to the person in the street, but they are real. That's why we have high house prices, and anybody who's slowing down the process should be facing the consequences of that. We need a system of governance that's transparent, that's fast, that's efficient, that's effective. Developers may not always succeed, but it has to be done quickly.
There was a another proposal that was something like every arterial road that had a transit station on it, or maybe it was just the transit areas, automatically could have 17 floors, 17 stories. Does that make sense?
Again, something to experiment. The downside on this one is probably developers will tell you that given land prices on those arterial roads, they need to go higher than 17. So even if they had the right to build 17, they probably need to go 40. So in principle, a good idea, something to experiment with, but again, something to push even further.
Another issue, I think that local zoning was supposed to be the purview of municipalities and our governance structure. Last year, the Ontario government put in place something like 27 ministerial zoning orders, which is the Minister of Housing can overrule whatever the local official plan and zoning rules are and institute higher density. And what I heard is that the vast majority of those were around transit areas that Metrolinx and the TTC were building, and they just wanted higher density around those transit areas. Does that right? The government can just sort of swoop in and overrule all the local processes and put in huge density?
Well, if the government is putting in a lot of funds for those transit in the first place, and the government really values housing and affordability, then I think it's perfectly entitled as part of an overall package to demand these higher densities. Obviously, there have to be rules around environment and safety and the rest of it, but as part of a complete package, I don't see why you would develop a transit station just for very few local people. The only way of making transit financially feasible is to have a lot of people using it. And for that, you need a lot of density and a lot of housing and a lot of affordability.
The other issue that I think that is relevant to talk about is this issue in regards to the development fees that are being charged. And it seems almost the opposite of everything that we've talked about so far, that you've said that government is the problem, supply is the problem, that we've got to put in place some rules and regulations. We got to try some things to increase supply. And at the same time, this past year, the city of Toronto increased development fees by 47%. And development fees and other things are going up in other cities around the Greater Toronto area. And on top of that, they're putting in place a new policy called Inclusionary Zoning, which is going to demand that developers that are in transit areas have to set aside 10 to 20% of their units to be affordable, not affordable, I think the way that you sort of define affordable for everyone, but affordable for people that are making a very low income. These extra restrictions and costs on developers at the same time as you're talking about all the problems and the 1.8 million extra homes that we need. Does that make any logical sense?
No, most of the economists have really dug into this issue of development fees, and the usual finding is that development fees are passed on to home buyers. It's developers don't have lower profit margins as a result. That they don't eat the development fees. It just over time it gets passed on to higher house prices. So now some of these development fees are needed for, and they need to be targeted at critical local infrastructure, putting in extra hydro lines, extra power, water, etc. So some development fees are needed for that, but that just means that it's passed on to the home buyer. I think an interesting innovation in this area, maybe, and I don't know too much about it, but it seems in Quebec that it's the province that takes on a lot of these costs. And so development fees in Quebec are significantly lower than in Ontario. And this may be part of the reason why in history you've had a lot more housing affordability in Quebec. Now, there's a lot of other factors there in history and the rest of it. But it is interesting that the province takes up some of these development costs in Quebec.
I saw a statistic that's kind of interesting, and maybe is proof positive that you're right about the level of housing affordability in Quebec being better than Ontario. Last year was the first year since the early 1970s that there was out-migration from Ontario to Quebec. So people in Ontario actually chose to move to Quebec. And ever since the 1970s, it's been the reverse, people from Quebec choosing to move to Ontario.
Yeah, Quebec is showing stronger economic growth. At first blush, they may have higher taxes, so there are some immediate downsides, but this is potentially way outweighed by lower housing costs. So if you take all of the costs that you're faced, Quebec is becoming a lot more attractive place to live and work.
Help me understand an issue. I've always been a believer in a progressive tax system, and that it's a society should be paying taxes for social societal goods. If you want a new library or new traffic signal or some new infrastructure or a new sewer, and so therefore you need to charge a development fee, or even worse than that, if you want a new park, and so therefore you're going to have the donation of a park or a payment in lieu of park space, or even public art, which is another thing that developers are often charged for. If all those things aren't going to eat into a developer's profit, but actually be passed on to the new consumer, the new buyer, why is there any rationale that all those costs of benefit to society in general should be borne by arguably young people that are buying their first home, or new home buyers, or new people that are coming to Toronto? Why shouldn't that be an expense of all of society, not just of new people? Like it doesn't make logical sense.
Yeah,
there's no fairness in that, is there?
I completely agree with you. Unfortunately, this is the way that the tax system has been set up in Ontario. And this is not just, I mean, it gets back to the Canadian saying that municipalities are creatures of the provinces. It's all a reflection of that tax system and the way it's been set up in Ontario. It makes absolutely no sense that the young new home buyers are bearing the costs for libraries. I mean, if there's a new development and it's a very large development and you need a new police station in there, I can sort of see it. But
no police station is just for one development. A police station is going to be a good for all of society.
Yeah. So I'm trying to give you a balanced answer, but I really agree with the gist of your question. A lot of these expenditures should be funded out of general taxation, progressive income tax, and that's all of that good stuff. It should not be a tax on new home buyers, which effectively it is.
So it really seems to me like our housing affordability issue is completely the cause of our municipal and provincial governments and their lack of attention to this issue, such that they've created a huge amount of red tape, created 3 to 5 to 7 years worth of bureaucracy that developers have got to run through, giving into NIMBYism such that you don't develop what in a normal circumstance you probably would have built. And they get involved in a whole bunch of other things in regards to influencing those the construction of those developments that doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't add a lot of value, just slows stuff down and creates a situation where you need 1.8 million extra homes than you're otherwise going to be built. Isn't that the problem? Government's the problem here?
People operate within a policy framework that the democratically elected government decides, and this is what we're left with. So how to reform that, how to change that, that's the tough question.
We're chatting tonight about housing affordability, the lack thereof, and what potential solutions are, the impact of interest rates on that, the impact of government on that, and what do we do? We're going to take a break for 2 minutes of messages and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As I've said before, it's kind of happy day for me because this is my 1,000th interview. Not my 1,000th show yet, because as I've said, I've interviewed on some shows more than one person, but I'm getting close there. But it's 1,000 interviews. Doctor, actually, after interviewing for about 45 minutes, 1,000 people, you sort of get, an interesting breadth of interesting information. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Joe Barrich, principal of urban strategies. And he said governance was the problem. And he said that part of the problem with the OLT, the Ontario Land Tribunal, and the OMB before that, is that councillors don't have to act like adults. They can act like kids because they know that someone's going to overrule them in the end. I thought that was an interesting comment. And I interviewed the head of Build, who I think comparable to you thought that there was a dramatic problem with red tape and inefficiency and bureaucracy. I've interviewed a couple of developers that have just said, we're going to make our 20% no matter what. And so therefore with inclusionary zoning, all of the cost of inclusionary zoning is going to go to other people. And so therefore, yeah, the city of Toronto is going to make a couple of suites more affordable for the lucky few that get those suites, but they're going to make it less affordable for the 90% of the unlucky ones that don't get those suites. So it really seems like we've got a big issue here. And I wonder, is there any solution? If you were the Minister of Housing, if you were the Premier of Ontario, what would you do?
Oh boy. That's a tough question.
That's why I asked the smart guy.
I have to give a fairly simple answer, but there must be some way of streamlining all of this. That would be, but maybe that's an over sort of simplistic initial take of it. I think the other part is the one we touched on at the end of the conversation there, the whole structure of taxation, municipal fees, etc. A lot of this structure seems to be a way for municipalities to get some sort of revenue that they may not be getting from the provincial government. So, and this all ends up in driving house prices up. So I think Ontario probably needs to take a look at is some of this funding being done in the most efficient way possible. It's maybe more a question rather than the Minister of Housing that the Minister of Finance needs to get involved. Is that whole structure of taxing and spending within the province organized efficiently? I think it's broader than a housing issue.
I worry that the Minister of Housing, the Minister of Finance, and the Premier aren't going to listen to you, and we're not going to actually make the improvements that that you're calling for that we need to make. If we don't change things and they stay as restrictive as they are, what's going to happen? If we already have housing that is twice or 170% of our disposable income, twice as impactful as it was a generation ago, higher, maybe 2 times higher than it is in the United States. Is it going to become 4 times higher? Are we going to have 250%? Or is Toronto going to just like break and people are going to have to go to Parry Sound or Bracebridge or somewhere?
If things don't change, there are all sorts of negative scenarios you can dream up. Those are some of them. Another one is that the debt levels continue to go up, but then there's a global economic crisis and people lose their jobs and they can't service the debt, and then you have an almighty mess. That's another scenario. Another scenario is a slow economic decline and grind of Toronto. People just eventually giving up, and as you say, they have to move to Winnipeg or something. And you've already seen the population growth in Toronto and Vancouver is slower than in, say, Calgary and Edmonton. And so the economic dynamism of Toronto declines. It's just the people who can afford to live there that live there. It becomes a bit of a theme park. So
Toronto is a theme park. That's interesting.
So there are all sorts of negative scenarios, and not addressing affordability. It's not current at the moment, but a few years ago there was social tension in San Francisco because of high house prices, and nobody could get a place to live. It just seems to create a lot of stress, a lot of tension, a lot of economic damage. And without fixing it some way, there are a lot of negative scenarios you can cook up.
I want to add another one. And I think that this is a real risk. People haven't been talking about it, but I think it is civil strife, civil disobedience. We saw some of that in the pandemic when people disagreed with mask mandates, vaccine passports, etc. I think that one of the things that we've come to expect in our society is that we can have a place to live. And maybe we don't have that dream of a single family house with a pool anymore. That may be out of reach of a lot of people, but we do expect that we have a place to live that's affordable somewhere close to our job. And if we take that away from the next generation, and I think we are effectively taking it away from the next generation, as that the increased housing prices really benefit the baby boomers that have already bought in and can enjoy that unbelievable appreciation. And it's the new younger people that are never going to buy into this almost a pyramid scheme type structure. I think people lose faith in the system. They lose faith in their governments. They lose faith in that opportunity that they've got. And I think it can lead to civil strife. And I think that that has happened in the past, and I think it could happen again. And whether it leads to civil disobedience or whether it leads to a populist on either the right or the left that can speak to the weakness in the society, to the complaint of those people, I think it ends up being a real issue. And I think it's something that governments have got to address, because it is a problem, I believe, that is primarily a creation of government, and particularly municipal governments, but also provincial. Because I do think, and I used to be in the pharmaceutical business, and the pharmaceutical business, we talked about 5 to 7 years and $1 billion to get a drug approved. And in the pharmaceutical business, you know what? It made sense, because you had to do a whole bunch of testing and prove that things worked, and you had to dose it in 1,000 people or 5,000 people. And you had to then do this study, and you had to take it to the Health Canada or to the FDA. I don't think that's the case with building an apartment building. I don't think you have to go through that same sort of testing and approval. I think it's just a bureaucracy that has spread out to create an incredible amount of red tape, to ask a whole bunch of questions over and over and over again, allow NIMBYism, and then have counselors and planning staffs that don't have the backbone to stand up to that NIMBYism. And so I think that your report that you published about the 1.8 is a call to action. I think that the Housing Affordability Task Force is a call to action. And I think that the housing prices that we have seen and the lack of affordability for our children are calls to action, and that we're going to have to take action. And so I think that this is the issue of the day. I think climate change may be the issue of the generation, but I think that housing affordability is the issue of the day or the year. And so it is an honor, sir, for me to chat with you about it on my 1,000th interview. That's our show for tonight. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, sir, for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Ottawa or Queen's Park at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.